Good morning. Page 228. It's chapter 10. Behind the wire, the ground is burning. No, the surprising thing is not that mutinies and risings did not occur in the camps, but that in spite of everything they did. Like all embarrassing events in our history, which means 3/4 of what really happened, these mutinies have been neatly cut out and the gap hidden with an invisible join. Those who took part in them have been destroyed, and even remote witnesses frightened into silence. The reports of those who suppressed them have been burned or hidden in safes within safes, so that the risings have already become a myth, although some of them happened only 15 and others only 10 years ago. No wonder some say that there was no Christ, no Buddha, no Muhammad. There you're dealing in thousands of years. When it can no longer disturb any living person, historians will be given access to what is left of the documents. Archaeologists will do a little digging, heat something in a laboratory, and the dates, locations, contours of these risings, the names of their leaders will come to light. We shall see the first outbreaks, like the Ch10 affair of January 1942 in the Oshkuria separate campsite near Ust-Uzi. Ch10 is said to have been a free employee, perhaps even in charge of this detachment. He sounded the call to the 58th and the socially harmful Article 7, Section 35, and rallied a few hundred volunteers. They disarmed the convoy, which consisted of short-sentence prisoner guards, and escaped with some horses into the forest to live as partisans. They were killed off gradually. In spring 1945, people had no connection with it at all were still being jailed for the Ch10 affair. Perhaps we, no, not we ourselves, shall learn at a later time about the legendary rising in 1948 at Public Works Site number 501, where Svaya Matska Salakard Railway was under construction. It was legendary because everybody in the camps talked about it in whispers, but no one really knew anything. Legendary also because it broke out not in the special camp system where the mood and the grounds for it by now existed, but in a corrective labor camp where people were isolated from each other by fear of informers and trampled underfoot by thieves, where even to their right to be politicals was spat upon, and where a prison mutiny therefore seemed inconceivable. According to the rumors, it was all the work of ex-soldiers, recent ex-soldiers. It could not have been otherwise. Without them, the 58s lacked stamina, spirit, and leadership. But these young men, hardly any of them over 30, were officers and enlisted men from our fighting armies, or their fellows who had been prisoners of war. Among these, some had been with Vlasov or Krasnov, or in the nationalist units. There were men who had fought against each other, but here oppression united them. These young men who had served on all fronts in a world war, who were expert in modern infantry warfare, camouflage, and picking off patrols. These young men, except those who were scattered singly, still remain in 1948 their wartime elan and belief in themselves, and they could not accept the idea that men like themselves, whole battalions of them, should meekly die. Even escape seemed to them a contemptible half measure, rather like deserting one by one instead of facing the enemy together. It was all planned and begun in one particular team. An ex-colonel called Voronin, or Voronov, a one-eyed man, is said to have been the leader. A first lieutenant of armored troops, Sakarenko, was also mentioned. The team killed their convoy guards. In those days, convoy guards, often unlike their charges, were not real soldiers, but reservists. Then they went and freed a second team, and a third. They attacked the convoy guards' hamlet, then the camp from outside, removed the sentries from the towers, and opened up the camp area. The inevitable schism now took place. Though the gates were wide open, most of the Zeks would not go through them. These included prisoners with short sentences, who had nothing to gain from mutiny. There were others with tenors, or even with 15 years under the 7/8 and 4/6 decrees, who would be worse off under Article 58. Finally, there were even 58s of the sort who preferred to die kneeling loyally rather than on their feet. Nor were all those who poured out through the gate necessarily on their way to help the mutineers. Some felons happily broke bounds to plunder the free settlements, arming themselves with weapons taken from the guards, who were later buried at the Kochmat cemetery. The rebels went on to capture the neighboring camp division. With their combined forces, they decided to advance on Vorkuta. It was only 60 kilometers away, but this was not to be. Parachute troops were dropped to bar their way. Then low-flying fighter planes raked them with machine gun fire and dispersed them. They were tried, more of them were shot, and others given 25 or 10 years. At the same time, many of those who had not joined in the operation but remained in camp had their sentences refreshed. The hopelessness of its rising as a military operation is obvious, but would you say that dying quietly by inches was more hopeful? The special camps were set up soon after this, and most of the 58s were raked out. What was the result? In 1949, the Nizhny Turyak division of Arlag, a mutiny started in much the same way. They disarmed their guards, took 6 or 8 Tommy guns, attacked the camp from outside, knocked the sentries off the towers, cut the telephone wires, and opened up the camp. This time there was no one in the camp who was not numbered, branded, doomed beyond all hope. And what do you think happened? Most prisoners would not pass through the gates. Those who had started it all, and now had nothing to lose, turned the mutiny into a breakout, and a group of them headed to Miligi at Algina, Toscana. Their way was barred by troops and light tanks. General Semenov was in command of the operation. They were all killed. Riddle: what is the quickest thing in the world? Answer: thought. It is and it isn't. It can be slow too. Oh, how slow. Only slowly and laboriously do men, people, society realize what happened to them, realize the truth about their position. In herding the 58s into special camps, Stalin was exerting strength, mainly for its own amusement. He already had them securely confined as they could be, but he thought they would be craftier than ever and improve on his best. He thought he would be craftier than ever. He thought he knew how to make it still more frightening. The results were quite the opposite. The whole system of repression, elaborated in his reign, was based on keeping malcontents apart, preventing them from reading each other's eyes and discovering how many of them there were, instilling into all of them, even into the most dissatisfied, that no one was dissatisfied except for a few doomed individuals, blindly vicious and spiritually bankrupt. In the special camps, however, there were malcontents by the thousands. They knew their numerical strength and realized that they were not spiritual paupers, that they had a nobler conception of what life should be, then their jailers, then their betrayers, then the theorists who tried to explain why they must rot in camps. This novel aspect of the special camp went almost unnoticed at first. On the face of it, things went on as though it was a continuation of the corrective labor camp, except that the thieves, those pillars of camp discipline and of authority, soon lost heart. Still crueler warders and an enlarged disciplinary barracks seemed to compensate for this loss. But mark this, when the thieves lost heart, there was no more pilfering in the camp. You could now leave your rations in your locker. You could drop your shoes on the floor at night instead of putting them under your pillow, and they would be there in the morning. You could leave your pouch on your locker for the night, instead of lying with it in your pocket or rubbing the tobacco to dust. Trivialities, you say? No, all enormously important. Once there was no pilfering, people began to look at their neighbors kindly and without suspicion. Listen, lads, maybe we really are politicals. And if we're politicals, we can speak a bit more freely. Between two bunks or by the fire on the work site. Better look around, of course, in case somebody's listening. Come to think of it, it doesn't matter a damn if they frame us. If you've got a quarter already, what else can they do to you? The old camp mentality. You die first, I'll wait a bit. There's no justice, so forget it. That's the way it was, and that's the way it will be, also began to disappear. Why forget it? Why must it always be so? Teammates began quietly talking to each other, not about rations, not about gruel, but about things which you never hear mentioned outside, and talking more and more freely all the time, until the foreman's fist suddenly ceases to throb with self-importance. Some foremen stop raising their fists altogether, others use them less often and less heavily. The foreman himself, instead of towering over his men, sits down to listen and to chat, and his team begin to look at him as a comrade. After all, he's one of us. The foreman come to the production planning section or the accounts office, and from discussing with them dozens of small questions, whose rations should be cut and whose shouldn't, whom to assign to which job, the trustees too are affected by this breath of fresh air. The small cloud of seriousness, responsibility, and purpose. Not all of them at once. They had come to the camps greedily intent on grabbing their best jobs, and they had succeeded. They saw no reason why they shouldn't live as well as our corrective labor camps. They shouldn't live as well as in the corrective labor camps, shutting themselves up in their private rooms, roasting their potatoes with pork fat, and live their own lives, separate from the workers. But no, it turned out that there was something more important than all of this. And what might that be? It became indecent to boast about being a bloodsucker, as people did in the corrective labor camps, to boast that you lived at the expense of others, so trustees would make friends among the workers, spread their nice new jerkins beside the workers' grubby ones, and lie on the ground happily chatting their Sundays away. People could no longer be divided into such crude categories as in the corrective labor camps, trustees and workers, non-politicals and 58s. The breakdown was much more complex and interesting. People from the same region, religious groups, men of practical experience, men of learning. It would take the authorities a long, long time to notice or to understand, but the work assigners no longer carried clubs and didn't even bellow as loudly as before. They addressed the foreman in a friendly way. For example, must be about time to get your men out to work, come up. Not because they were overcome by remorse, but because there was something new and disquieting in the air. But all this happened slowly. These changes took months and months and months. They did not affect every foreman and every trustee, only those in whom some remnants of conscience and fraternal feeling still glowed under the ashes. Those who preferred to go on being bastards found no difficulty in doing just that. As yet there was no real shift of consciousness, no heroic shift, no spiritual upheaval. The camp remained a camp as before, We were as much oppressed and helpless as ever. There was still no hope for us but to crawl away under the wire and to run into the steppe, to be showered with bullets and hunted down with dogs. A bold thought, a desperate thought, a thought to raise our man up. How could things be changed so that instead of us running from them, they would run from us? Once the question was put, once a certain number of people had thought of it and put it into words, a certain number had listened to them, the age of escapes was over, the age of rebellion had begun. But how to begin, or where to begin? We were shackled, we were wrapped about by tentacles, we were deprived of freedom, of movement. Where could we begin? Far from simple in this life are the simplest things of all. Even in the corrective labor camps, some people seem to have got round to the idea that stool pigeons should be killed. Even there, accidents were sometimes arranged. A log would roll off a pile and knock a stoolie into a swollen river, so that it should not have been difficult to figure out in the special camps which tentacles to hack off first. You would expect everybody to see that, yet nobody did. Suddenly, a suicide in the disciplinary barracks, hut number 2, a man was found hanging. I am going through the stages of the process as they occurred in Ekabatsus, but note that the stages were just the same as in other special camps. The bosses were not greatly upset. They cut him down and wheeled him off to the scrap heap. A rumor went around the work team. The man was an informer. He hadn't hanged himself. He had been hanged. As a lesson to the rest. There were a lot of filthy swine in camp, but none so hawkish, so crude, so brazen as Timothy S., who was in charge of the men's hut. His bodyguards were fat, pig-faced cooks, and he had also hand-reared a retinue of thuggish orderlies. He and his retainers beat the sex with fists and sticks. On one occasion, quite unjustly, he struck a short, swarthy prisoner, whom everybody called the Kid. It was not his habit to notice whom he was beating. There were no mere kids, as things now were in the special camps, and this kid was also a Muslim. There were quite a few Muslims in the camp. They were not just common criminals. You could see them praying at sunset at the western end of the camp area. In a corrective labor camp, people would have laughed, but we did not. Throwing up their arms and pressing their foreheads to the ground, they had elders, and true to the spirit of the times, they met in council. The motion was to avenge themselves. Early one Sunday morning, the victim, together with an adult companion, an English, slipped into the trustees' hut while they were still wallowing in bed, and each of them quickly struck a knife into the fat hog. But how green we still were. They did not try to hide their faces or to run away. At peace with themselves, now that duty was done, they went with their bloody knives straight from the corpse to the warder's room and gave themselves up. They would be put on trial. All these were tentatives, fumblings. All this could perhaps have happened in a corrective labor camp, but civic thought made further strides. Perhaps this was a crucial link at which the chain must be broken. Kill the stoolie. That was it, the vital link. A knife in the heart of the stoolie. Make knives and cut stoolie's throats. That was it. Now, as I write this chapter, rows of humane books frown down at me from the walls, the tarnished gilt on their well-worn spines, glinting reproachfully like stars through cloud. Nothing in the world should be sought through violence. By taking up the sword, the knife, the rifle, we quickly put ourselves on the level of our tormentors and persecutors, and there will be no end to it. There will be no end. Here at my desk, in a warm place. I completely agree. If you ever get 25 years for nothing, If you find yourself wearing 4 number patches on your clothes, holding your hands permanently behind your back, submitting to searches morning and evening, working until you are utterly exhausted, dragged into the cooler whenever somebody denounces you, trodden deeper and deeper into the ground from the hole you're in, the fine words of the great humanists will sound like chatter of the well-fed and free. There will be no end to it, but will there be a beginning? Will there be a ray of hope in our lives or not? The oppressed at least concluded that evil cannot be cast out by good. Stoolies, you say, are human beings too. Warders went around the barracks, and to intimidate us read out orders addressed to the whole Peshani camp complex. At one of the women's divisions, 2 girls, their dates of birth were given. They were very young, had indulged in anti-Soviet talk, a tribunal consisting of death by shooting. Those girls, whispering together on their bunks, had 10 years hanging around their necks already. What foul creature, with a burden of its own to carry, had turned them in? How can you say that stoolies are human beings? There were no misgivings. But the first blows were still not easy. I do not know about other places. They started killing in all the special camps. Even the Spats camp for sick and disabled. But in our camp it began with the arrival of the Dubovka transport, mainly Western Ukrainians, OUN members. The movement everywhere owed a lot to these people, and indeed it was they who set the wheels in motion. The Dubovka transport brought us the bacillus of rebellion. These sturdy young fellows, fresh from the guerrilla trails, looked around themselves in Dubovka, were horrified by the apathy and slavery they saw, and reached for their knives. In Dubovka, it had quickly ended in mutiny, arson, and disbandment, but the camp bosses were so blindly sure of themselves. For 30 years they had met no opposition and grown used to it, that they did not take the trouble to even keep the rebels separated from us. They were scattered throughout the camp in various work teams. This was a corrected labor camp practice. Their dispersal muffled protest, but in our purer air, dispersal only helped the flames to engulf the whole mass more rapidly. The newcomers went to work with their teams, but never lifted a finger or just made a show of it. Instead, they lay in the sun. It was summer, conversing quietly. At some times, to the casual eye, they looked very much like thieves making law, especially as they, too, were well-nourished, broad-shouldered young men. A law indeed emerged, but it was a new and surprising law. You whose conscience is unclean, this night you die. Murders followed one another in quicker succession than escapes in the best period. They were carried out confidently and anonymously. No one went with a blood-stained knife to give himself up. They saved themselves and their knives for another deed. At their favorite time, when a single warder was unlocking huts of one after another, and while nearly all prisoners were still sleeping, the masked avengers entered a particular section, went up to a particular bunk, and unhesitatingly killed the traitor, who might be awake and howling in terror, or might be still asleep. When they had made sure that he was dead, they walked swiftly away. They wore masks and their numbers could not be seen. They were either picked off or covered, but if the victims' neighbors should recognize them by their general appearance, so far from hurrying to volunteer information, they would not give in even under interrogation, even under threat from the godfathers, but would repeat over and over again, "No, I don't know anything, I didn't see anything." And this was not simply in recognition of the hoary truth known to all the oppressed. What you don't know can't hurt you. It was self-preservation, because anyone who gave names would have been killed next 5 a.m., and the security officer's goodwill would have been no help to him at all. And so murder, although as yet there had been fewer than a dozen, became the rule, became a normal occurrence. Anybody been killed today? Prisoners would ask each other when they went to wash or collect their morning rations. In this cruel sport, the prisoner's ear heard the subterranean gong of justice. It was done in a strictly conspiratorial fashion. Somewhere, somewhere, someone of recognized authority simply gave a name to someone else. He's the one. He was not concerned with who would do the killing, or on what date, or where the knives would come from. And the hitmen, who were concerned with all these things, did not know the judge whose sentence they must carry out. Bearing in mind the impossibility of documented confirmation that a man was an informer, we are bound to acknowledge that improperly constituted, illegal, and invisible court was much more accurate in its judgment, much less often mistaken than any of the tribunals, panels of 3, courts martial, or special boards with which we are familiar. The chopping, as we called it, went so smoothly that it began to encroach on the daytime and become almost public. A small, blotchy-faced barracks elder, once a big NKVD man in Rostov, a notorious louse, was killed one Sunday afternoon in the bucket room. Prisoners had become so hardened that they crowded in to see the corpse lying in a pool of blood. Next, the Avengers ran through the camp with knives in broad daylight, chasing the informer who had betrayed. A tunnel under the camp area from the disciplinary barracks had number 8, the camp command, and had woken up and herded the Dubovka regulators into it, but by now the chopping went on just as well without them. The informer fled from them into staff barracks. They followed. He rushed into the office of the divisional commander, Fat Major Maximenko, and they were still behind him. At that moment, the camp barber was shaving the major in his armchair. The major was unarmed. In accordance with camp regulations, they are not supposed to carry firearms into the camp area. When he saw the murderers armed with knives, the terrified major jumped up from under the razor and begged for mercy, thinking that they were about to knife him. He was relieved to see them cut up sturdily before his very eyes. Nobody was even after the major. The nascent movement had issued a directive, only stoolies to be killed, orders and offers not to be touched. All the same, the major jumped out the window, half-shaven, with a white smock wrapped around him, and ran for the guardhouse, shouting in panic. You in the watchtower, shoot, I say. The watchtower did not open fire. On one occasion, a stoolie broke away before they could finish the job and rushed wounded to the hospital. There he was operated on and bandaged up, but as the major had been frightened out of his wits by knives, could the hospital save its stoolie? 2 or 3 days later, they finished him off on a hospital bed. Out of 5,000 men, about a dozen were killed, but with every stroke of a knife, more and more of the twining tentacles fell away. A remarkable fresh breeze was blowing. On the surface, we were prisoners living in a camp just as before, but in reality we had become free. Free because for the very first time in our lives, we had started saying openly and aloud all that we thought. No one who has not experienced this transition can imagine what it is like. And the informers stopped informing. Until then, a security officer could make anyone he liked stay behind in camp in the daytime, talk to him for hours on end, whether to collect denunciations, give new instructions, or elicit the names of prisoners who looked out of the ordinary, who had done nothing so far but were capable of it, who were suspected of being possible nuclei for future resistance. When his work team came back in the evening, they would question their mate, "Why did they send for you?" And he would always reply, whether it was truth or impudent bluff, "They wanted to show me some photographs." True enough, many prisoners were shown photographs and asked to identify people whom they might have known during the war, but the security officers couldn't show them to everybody, and anyways it would have been pointless. Yet everybody, friends and traitors alike, always mentioned them. Suspicion moved in with us and forced us into our shells. But by now, the air was being cleansed of suspicion. Now, even if a security officer ordered somebody to stay away from work lineup, he would not. Incredible, unheard of in all the years of the Ch10 GPU and BD's existence. They summoned a man, and instead of dragging himself there with his heart missing beats, instead of trotting in with a servile look on his silly face, he preserved his dignity. His teammates were watching and refused to go. An invisible balance hung in the air over the work lineup. In one of its scales, all the familiar phantoms were heaped. Interrogation officers, punches, beatings, sleepless standings, boxes, cells too small to sit or lie down in, cold, damp punishment cells, rats, bedbugs, tribunals, and second and third sentences. But this could not all happen at once. This was a slow, grinding bone mill. It could not devour all of us at once and process us in a single day, and even when they had been through it, as every one of us had, men still went on existing, while in the other scale lay nothing but a single knife. But that knife was meant for you if you gave in. It was meant for you alone in the breast, and not some time or other. But at dawn tomorrow, and all the forces of the Ch10 MGB could not save you from it. It was not a long one, but just right for neat insertion between your ribs. It didn't even have a proper handle, just a piece of cold insulation tape wound around the blunt end of the blade, but this gave a very good grip, so the knife would not slip out of the hand. And this bracing thread weighed heavier. It gave the weak strength to tear off their leeches, to pass by and follow their mates. It also gave them a good excuse later on. We would have stayed behind, citizen officer, but we were afraid of the knife. You weren't threatened by it. You can't imagine what it's like. This was not all. Not only did they stop answering summonses of the security officers and other camp authorities, they were now chary of dropping an envelope or any bit of paper with writing on it into the mailbox, which hung up in the camp area, or the boxes for complaints to higher authority. Before mailing a letter or putting in a complaint, they would ask someone to look at it. Go on, read it. It isn't a denunciation. Come with me while I mail it. Oh, what a great chapter. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.